We are going to go over the best PvP armor perks in New World. There's a ton of different perks that you can roll on your armor for PvP, but there's only a few that is actually best in slot perks for your PvP armor. The first best in slot perk that you're going to require on your armor is called Resilient. Resilient will reduce critical damage when somebody crits you. Resilient is so strong that if you have 5 pieces of Resilient on your armor and 150 con in your attributes, that some weapons crits will basically be nullified, and all of the crits on the weapons abilities and auto attacks will basically feel like normal attacks, and all of those crits will be useless. So if you're going to pick one perk for your PvP armor, it's going to have to be Resilient. The reason why you should take Resilient and why Resilient is so strong is because there's a lot of crits in New World. Headshots counts as crits, backstab counts as crits, and the formula for crits is also boosted, meaning that crit chance increases with each non-crit. For example, if you have 5% crit, each time you don't crit, that percentage will increase with 5%. So for example, if you have 5% crit and you don't crit, your crit chance will go up to 10%, then after you don't crit again, it will go up to 15, then 20. So it increases with 5 with each non-crit attack. So as you can see, there's a lot of crit damage in New World, and you're going to have to run Resilient on your armor to be competitive. Now that you understand how important Resilient is in New World, the next best perk for PvP is going to be Shirking Fortification. When you have Shirking Fortification on your armor, each time you dodge through an enemy's attack, you gain Fortify. If you didn't know, Fortify reduces your damage taken. You get a resistance buff that reduces all damage. So now you know what Shirking Fortification does, but why is Shirking Fortification so strong? Shirking Fortification is so strong because it basically counters rend. If you didn't know, if rend is applied to you, your defenses is reduced, but if you dodge with Shrinking Fortification, your defense is upgraded or increased. So it basically counters rend. And there's a lot of abilities in New World that has rend. For example, Ice Showers and the Sundering Shockwave perk ability from the Warhammer. This is why Shirking Fortification is such a good perk to have on your PvP armor. If you want to go and farm the Shirking Fortification crafting mod, you can go and farm it in Reekwater. The crafting mod is called Screaming Vines. You can farm this crafting mod by opening supply chest in Reekwater. This is really important since you want to craft your armor with Shrinking Fortification, since Resilient has such a high roll rate on armor. Before we continue, help me keep this channel alive by liking this video and subscribing. The last PvP perk that you're going to want on your armor is going to be a weapon perk. You get weapon perks in New World that enhances your weapons or your abilities of your weapon. For example, you get a perk called Sundering Shockwave that will apply a rend on the Warhammer Shockwave ability. These weapon perks can completely change your playstyle and your build, so make sure to choose the right weapon perk, since not all weapon perks are equal. Some are better, some are not as good. So let's say you don't need a weapon perk on your armor. What are some of the other perks that you can actually use on your armor that's going to be best in slot? So if you're not going to use a weapon perk on your armor, you can go for a perk called Shirking Energy, but this is going to require you to be in light roll, basically in the light equip threshold, so you can use the light roll dodge. What Shirking Energy will do is that if you dodge an attack, you will gain stamina, but take note it also has a cooldown and it doesn't stack. This perk will basically allow you an extra dodge if you dodge an attack, so this is a really good defensive perk for those light roll users, just to give them some extra survivability. If you don't care for Shirking Energy, you can also go for Refreshing or Refreshing Evasion. Basically, these two perks reduces your cooldown. Refreshing provides a flat cooldown, and Refreshing Evasion reduces your cooldowns each time you dodge. These two perks are really good since you always need some cooldown reduction to be effective in a fight. The more cooldown reduction you have, the more abilities you can spam and the more damage you can do. Two other good perks that you can use is called Elemental Aversion and Physical Aversion. These aversion perks basically reduce your damage taken from ranged attacks. For example, Elemental Aversion will reduce your damage taken from elemental range attacks, for example from mages, and Physical Aversion will reduce your damage taken from range attacks from like muskets, bows and blunderbusses and so forth. So basically any physical type of attack. If I have to choose between elemental aversion and physical aversion, I would go with elemental aversion. It just seems more useful in wars and attacks, and it will nicely counter all of those mages that want to cast abilities on you and do heavy attacks on you. Also, elemental aversion counters all of those AoE abilities that the mages cast, but take note it will only counter the first tick of the AoE ability. So the first damage tick of the AoE ability, elemental aversion will work on. I did make a video on testing elemental aversion. You can watch it after this video if you would like. But just take my word for it, elemental aversion is better than physical aversion at the moment. Now for the last perk you might want to consider getting on your armor is called Freedom. The perk Freedom basically reduces the duration of crowd control effects like stuns, slows and roots. So it reduces the duration of those effects. If you're going to have freedom on your armor, you need at least 3 pieces of freedom on your armor. 3 pieces of freedom on your armor is good enough to iframe a heavy attack from a warhammer after a shockwave. So I think 3 pieces of freedom is good enough for any build. Just take note that freedom has fallen from fame. It used to be one of those best in slot perks that you can find in New World, but with the arena update they introduced diminishing returns on roots and stuns. Freedom is still a good perk on PvP armor, but it just isn't as good as it used to be. If I had to rank these perks in order of importance, I would say Resilient is the most important perk, then Shirking Fortification, then a weapon perk, then Shirking Energy. After that I would say either Refreshing or Refreshing Evasion, and then Elemental Aversion, and lastly Freedom. Just remember that all of these perks are top tier except for Resilient. Resilient is a must have. There's no tier for Resilient, it's probably God tier, so Resilient is a must. Also I rank Shirking Fortification above a weapon perk because some weapon perk abilities are better on your weapon now than on your armor. So I would rather go with Shirking Fortification on my armor than a weapon perk. And I would keep the weapon perk on my weapon instead of my armor, just to have that extra damage or effect on the perk. Also, if I was going to craft an armor set for myself, I would force Shirking Fortification on my armor, since Resilient has such a high roll rate on my armor, and I would also force Constitution, since the resale value of the armor is probably going to be better if you force Con on it, since you can use it with any build. And let's say the wrong weapon perk rolls on the armor, you can at least sell that armor. If you've liked this video, consider subscribing. I post new World videos every week.